This evening we begin a series of excursions into high legendary. And perhaps we might take a moment to introduce the general theme. As you probably well know, most of the sources of our knowledge of the great religions of the world are historically uncertain. We find that even in religious and philosophical systems that have come into existence in the last 1,000 years, data is seldom adequate. Perhaps one reason lies in the fact that most of the human experiences which have resulted in an important revelation have been highly subjective to the historical person. Usually, such information was scanty. During the person's life, he was not honored, he was not recognized, he found very little place in the pages of history. But the human mind is not inclined to leave matters like this. And gradually, myth fills in where history is inadequate. Always also there are certain tales, legends, stories that have descended from one generation to another. These have frequently been considerably amplified in the passing of time. And where a religious factor is present, the miraculous is almost always superimposed upon the meager, demonstrable facts. This is true all over the world, and it is especially true in Asia. For we know that the Asiatic mind is very highly dramatic. Many of the great legends of the world have come from the East, and even those which we normally associate with the West may have had Oriental origins. Legends are wonderful ways of maintaining human interest in events which in themselves may be difficult or remote in time. So this evening we are going to study a fragment of the great transition which occurred in the descent of the Buddhistic tradition in the Far East. The Southern school of Buddhism, depending largely upon the Pali texts, has been termed the conservative school. Legends have arisen there, but they are few, and for the most part are held within the severity of what the Southern Buddhists believed to be the canonical writings. The Southern Buddhists depend almost entirely upon the earliest texts, and these, as might be expected, are the least embellished. Also, in the case of Buddhism, and a good parallel will be found in Christianity, actually Buddha left no written words that we are able to discover. As in most religious situations, the early perpetuation was by oral tradition only. And the Southern school takes it for granted that the earliest traditions, the earliest oral records, must necessarily be the most accurate. There may be considerable space for disagreement on this point, however. We are not sure that this is actually true, because these early records sometimes lack perspective. They represent highly localized points of view. We have, therefore, a parallel again with the Christian problem. The early Christian records are divided sharply into two groups. The records assumed to have been left by the apostles, the original group of disciples, and a rather different record which arose from the convictions of St. Paul. Pauline Christianity was quite different in many ways from the original revelation as it has come down to us. So we naturally ask the question, what was the source of the information of St. Paul? Why did he differ from the so-called gospel narratives in so many details? The answer appears to be that Paul had access to material which has not generally survived. He had the possibility of talking with others, of observing the reactions not of the 12, but of the stranger, of those who had only been beholders and not participants in the great Christian drama. From some point of view, either within himself or from circumstances, Paul grasped a structure that was more or less overlooked or ignored or even perhaps denied by those who were the closest of the apostles. The same thing happened in Asia. And perhaps the best way we can unfold this little story is to follow the legends, at least for a part of the way. In the northern school, the sutras, or records of the teachings of Buddha, are divided into two groups. The early records belonging to the southern school are acknowledged. They are affirmed to exist, and they are still the foundation of all that was built upon them. The northern school, however, claimed to possess other records, that in one way or another there had descended to them further instruction, arising also in the original words of Buddha, not merely in commentary, but in actual discourses which the great teacher gave. The northern school, therefore, divided the teachings of Buddha into a series of periods. They said that Buddha, at different times in his life, revealed different levels or layers of his instruction. It is said of Jesus that he taught the multitude in parables, but to the disciples he taught certain other things. Christendom does not know what those certain other things were. There seems to have been no descent in record. In Buddhism, the certain other things which Buddha may have taught are at least claimed to have been preserved. In the course, therefore, of the ministry of Buddha, beginning with the Prajnaparamita Sutra, his instruction is regarded as having become gradually more deep and more complete. And that as he passed along through his 45 years of earthly ministry, there were occasions when to those peculiarly wise or remarkably venerable he gave other instructions. And upon these other instructions, the northern school is built. These other instructions have been very bewildering to Western Orientalists. During the 19th century, when nearly all writers on Buddhistic matters were either military men stationed in India, merchants, travelers, or missionaries, there was a great fondness for the southern school. The peculiar severity of the doctrine, its profound skepticism, and the vestiges which seemed to linger in the southern belief, affirming that Buddha was atheistic, and also that he did not believe in the immortality of the human soul. These thoughts were quickly and eagerly grasped by the missionaries. It provided them with a splendid armament against Buddhism as far as Western thinking was concerned. They were in a position to contrast the best of Christianity with the worst of Buddhism and came up with some very dramatic, if not entirely realistic, conclusions. In any event, we are indebted mostly to these doubtful sources, some of them highly obviously prejudiced, for our Western concept of this Eastern philosophy almost to the time of the turn of the present century. Actually, of course, our knowledge of the whole matter in the West was probably only 200 or 300 years old, as far as any effort at scholarship or estimation could be concerned. As a result of this mass of early publication, highly critical, an attitude was established in the Western mind, an attitude that was not especially sympathetic. What these same scholars were very reluctant to bring forth was the Northern School. They would rather not discuss that at all. For in the Northern School, the similarities between Buddhism and Christianity increased very rapidly. In the Northern School, most of the concepts which the prejudiced 19th century German and English writers had brought forward were either contradicted or nullified. Thus it was not considered especially discreet to bring them up. Certainly not until a more modern, comprehensive grasp of Oriental philosophy was available. Many of the conditions have been corrected in the last 50 years, but the old prejudices linger on, and it is sometimes extremely difficult to uproot them. In the Mahayana system, the most important of all of the sutras of Buddha was the so-called last revelation. This is supposed to have occurred in the final assembly of Buddha and his arhats prior to the parinirvana. At this time, Buddha, having reached that period in his life's ministry in which he knew that his earthly mission was very nearly completed, felt impelled, according to the reports, to reveal the soul of the doctrine, that part which had been previously either completely concealed or at least only intimated to a few of his closest followers. A somewhat parallel account to this, of course, running very consistent with it, is the report as to the origin of Zen, which is also attributed directly to Buddha in a special occasion in which he transmitted the doctrine by nonverbal means to one of his disciples who became the first patriarch of Zen. So there are legends and myths about these things. How true they are, perhaps we can never fully be certain. But they are not more numerous, nor more extraordinary, nor more exceptional than those which also gathered around the early centuries of Christianity. And for that matter, they are to be found in the cradle years of every religious system. The great revelation which Buddha is supposed to have made is contained in the Saddhamma Pundarika Sutra, called the Sutra of the Lotus of the Good Law. This sutra, presumably, must have been transcribed by some person present, or perhaps carried in verbal descent for 2 or 3 or more generations. Again, the details are not certain, but the point that is made of really practical importance is that this sutra was never revealed. It was held either in a very small group, or else it was communicated privately, or perhaps by even another approach, this might have been the only instruction which he personally wrote down, and therefore was able to control the future of it. These are speculations. There are no certainties. The nature of the Sutra of the Lotus of the Good Law is quite suggestive of the Apocalypse of St. John. It is entirely different from practically any other early Buddhist writing. Many others descended from it, but this has an almost unique place in itself. In this sutra, the instruction is primarily attributed to Buddha. It is in the usual form, except that it exists in two parts. The first, prose, and the second, gatha. Gathas are poems. They are poetic renditions of sermons or great instructions. Gathas are also to be found in Persian religion, and it is held on some grounds that perhaps they were introduced into India by Persians. As a result of the two forms, the Sadhana Pundarika Sutra is really two books in one, with the texts exceedingly similar. It is as though you read a prose and then a poetic version of the same statements. Some sections are not in Gatha. They exist only in the prose form. But these are only about 4 or 5 out of the nearly 30 sections which make up the work. We say that the tone of the volume, or the tone of the instruction, is apocalyptical, that it is a great drama, an incredible unfolding in space. It has high majesty. It is entirely different in tone and in quality from the severe, highly moralistic doctrines of the Southern School. These doctrines are not contradicted, but they are expanded in a very curious way, one which has hardly been touched by Western thinkers at all. Only a few Orientalists have worked with it carefully. A fair version of the Lotus Sutra will be found in Max Muller's collection of the sacred books of the East. The general theme presents us with a series of new patterns which may be regarded as essentially esoteric. Certainly, they are highly mystical. Buddha is transformed in this sutra from the moral teacher who walked the dusty roads of Bengal to a symbol of universal reality. Buddha is transformed much as Jesus was transformed by Paul. The historical Jesus of the apostles and the mystical Christos of Paul. The Christos was a universal being, an ever-present power and majesty in space. And to a large measure, this is what happens in the Lotus Sutra. Buddha is the axis of it. He is a strangely detached axis. In the sutra, there is no warm humanity bestowed upon the Buddha personality. He is completely detached from all worldliness. And yet with it, there is this tremendous sense of the divine presence. Several authorities have come to the conclusion that in the Lotus Sutra, Buddha is lifted to a condition or position very close to divinity. And yet he is not divine. The sutra makes no effort to indicate that he is. In this sutra, Buddha becomes, so to say, one of the great flowerings of mankind. The Buddha seed sowed in space has produced the perfect lotus of the true law. Buddha is presented as the complete graduate from the processes of evolution. He is lifted up until he becomes the personification of all virtues, until he becomes the symbol of man as infinite. He is raised to the condition in which, to the practical mind, he could very easily become an object of worship. In fact, there is no doubt that Buddhism as a religion is founded squarely on the Lotus Sutra. Buddha, seated in the midst of space, becomes the axis of a drama that takes in both inconceivable time and inconceivable space. Buddha now becomes a symbol of the infinite attainment of life itself. In the Lotus Sutra, he represents mind as infinite thought, mind as eternal thought, mind unborn and undying. Not the mortal mind we know, but a strange infinite mind in which all things have an endless and enduring existence. This mind is ever changing in its appearances, ever different in its manifestations, ever moving from one integration to another, always unfolding, always growing, until the end is an absolute apocalypse. Wherever this tradition arose, it was certainly one of the most extraordinary products of man's creative skill, legendary, or dramatic power. It has been likened to the rituals of a great mystery school, something which, while passionless in itself, would create in man a tremendous passion after infinity. One of the first things that the Lotus Sutra reveals to us is that Buddha was not unique. While he represents this infinite expanse of consciousness, similar representations, equal representations exist everywhere. The universe as a causal, invisible realm is inhabited by an infinite number of completely enlightened beings. These enlightened beings are all Buddhas. They abide in the most remote places of space and time. Buddhism in this respect drew upon the great astronomical theories of the Brahmins and conceived a universe which is not in any way put to shame by modern science. For instead of using light years to measure time or distances, the Brahmins had their own calculations, but space extended out in countless billions of aeons of time and distance. And everywhere in this space, which unfolded like the enormous rows of Dante's Paradiso, everywhere in space were these meditating powers, these vast products of ageless evolution. All of this vast mystery did not descend from heaven. It rose from nature. It was a revelation of the infinite power contained in the mystery seeds of things, the bija seeds. The seeds of Buddha are cast in space, and they continue to unfold until each one reveals its complete enlightenment. And space is filled with an evolving order of creatures, beings, powers, all in infinite unfoldment. When the time comes for the sutra to begin, it has its own delightful, dramatic beginning. The great teacher, who is now both Buddha and an infinite symbol, is quietly meditating. And around him are gathered the aeons, the powers, an infinite number of arhats with their shaven heads, extending as far as the mind can think into eternity. Here also are gathered the great regiments of the Bodhisattvas in their wonderful princely habiliments. Here are the Brahmin gods from all the lokas of the ancient Hindu pantheon. Here also are the great processions of nuns, led by the wife of Buddha himself. Here are all the orders of the mendicants, the seekers, the believers. Here also, according to the artistic representations of these events in ancient fresco, are all the animal creatures, everything that lives. For this scene is a sort of infinite expansion of the Parinirvana scene. And in this also, Buddha is surrounded by examples of every type of living thing. Slowly, the great teacher emerges from meditation. And from the urna, or mysterious coil of light on his forehead, breaks forth the ray that illuminates all worlds. And the great company becomes, as it were, under the spell of an absolute waitingness. The great power was to speak. But before this power spoke, the sky was filled with clouds and lights. And down from the skies in all parts of the universe came the Buddhas of other worlds, other constellations, other planets, other levels of space, all coming to join in this great moment when the law was to be revealed. Now, it is well possible to imagine the power of this scene. The interpretation of it is extremely complicated. For as might be expected, the words that have been preserved and attributed to Buddha on this occasion are scarcely the secret of the situation. These words are again only veiled symbols. The obvious and evident meanings were not too clear. But out of the general sense of the meaning, out of the intimations, out of the strangely stated phrases, which are so much in the spirit of Eastern literature, there comes the gradual revelation of a total universe of light, a universe of things hidden and also of things revealed, a universe in which the mystery of the nirvana, or the extinction, or the idea that all things in Buddhist philosophy were to end in oblivion, was fragmented and dissipated. I think the point that was made, perhaps, in this discourse, at least that is one of the meanings that came to my thinking about it, was that it represented the transition of the mind from the total state of ignorance to the total state of awareness. The great concept of the cosmotheism of Buddhism, which means the cosmos itself as divinity, seems to rest upon the symbolism of the lotus. And perhaps that is why the sutra was so named. It would seem as though existence is divided into an upper and lower hemisphere. The lower hemisphere symbolized by water, and the higher hemisphere symbolized by light. From below, from the mud, from the slime, from the prehistoric origin of things, the lotus plant gradually grows upward to reach toward the light. And finally it reaches the surface, the place where the water and the light meet. And on this surface its blossom opens. And when its blossom opens, all of the corruption, all of the darkness, all of the mud and the slime is forgotten. For this blossom opens with absolute purity, indicating in its color and beauty no defilement of any kind. It is enlightened consciousness fed from the dark slime of ignorance. It is a very interesting and dramatic symbolism, and on it, of course, is based the concept that all Buddhas are shown seated upon lotus thrones, or the lotus is associated intimately with them. So the lotus becomes the symbol of the bursting open of consciousness. We have mentioned before in discussing things here that in Buddhism, the attainment of wisdom is not a direct action. It arises from the diminution of ignorance. Man becomes right by ceasing to be wrong. Right is not something attained by a direct action. Man cannot reach out and grasp truth. But when error in him ceases, truth is there. For error obscures truth. And truth can only be achieved by the consciousness outgrowing ignorance or error. When this is accomplished, man reaches the surface or the dividing point between his human consciousness and his universal consciousness. And in this we find Buddhism also borrowing something from the Vedanta and from the concept of Atman, the Hindu idea of inner reality. Just as surely as the entire meditation processes of Buddhism and the final trance state of the Arhat is very close to the concept of samadhi in more modern Hindu mysticism. In any event, what we seem to have here is that man finally reaches a state in which for the first time he is capable of knowing. That knowledge is not really unfolding step by step. Man is unfolding consciousness degree by degree by casting off error. But there comes a time when the scales tip, when the condition of ignorance can no longer control or hold. And in that moment, the individual passes into what might seem to him to be extinction. But it is only the final extinction of his own ignorance. It is ignorance and not man that dies. It is the three flames that go out, not the eternal flame. It is the conditioned being that ceases, the being that lives in a world of dimensions, a being whose entire existence is based upon dimensioned, conditioned attitudes, the being that can think of the universe only from the outside, the being that can conquer planets and remain unconquered in his own soul. But there comes this point which seems to be the burden of the Lotus Sutra, the point in which suddenly the little self dies and the self with the capital S takes over. In that moment is the beginning of man's true existence, an existence which he cannot comprehend till he attains it, an existence which, when not achieved, appears to be only a vacuum, the mystery of the void, as we find it in Chinese Buddhism. But what I think the Lotus Sutra attempts to do symbolically is to indicate something of the nature of this beyondness, this condition that arises when ignorance finally dies. And to represent it, there is the same kind of magnificent spectacle that we find in the Apocalypse of John and some of the Gnostic apocalyptic writings. Here the truth seeker, passing through the orbits of the planets, coming finally to the little door in heaven, passes through guided by the angel and stands in the presence of the heavenly mystery. This is also the story of Muhammad's night journey to heaven. It is a symbol of a mysterious journey, a journey from egoism to universalism, from the condition of being a person to the condition of absolute identity with absolute being. And as absolute being remains beyond our definition, no matter how mystically we may be inclined, and as the communication of it remains as the sovereign impossibility which Buddha himself would not attempt. Therefore, it can only be presented by a vast pageantry of symbols, a tremendous explosion of light, a tremendous expansion of the very ritual that is legendary perpetuated in the story of the temptation and the enlightenment or illumination of Buddha. In that moment, the heavens open, revealing also the tremendous hierarchy of divine powers. In the Lotus Sutra, this hierarchy is again present, infinitely magnified, attended by all who have achieved the liberation. The Arhats, in all probability, symbolize the ancient pre-Buddhistic teachers. The Arhats are the wise of all times, the wise of everlastingness, who in their own ages and their own worlds, but still part of humanity, at all times since the beginning of this unknown period that Buddhism does not even dare to calculate, have attained enlightenment, have come to be the meritorious, those who are justified, those who are true, a strange and wonderful order of sanctified beings. They are therefore present as part of this vast congregation. In the Lotus Sutra also we become more aware of the Bodhisattvas, which become quite important in the Northern School. One of the first that we come to know in the great epic is the Bodhisattva Maitreya. Maitreya, of course, was the custodian and guardian of the Tushita heaven, the heaven where Buddha himself awaited embodiment. He is supposed to be the next Buddha. Therefore, he contains within his own nature the accomplishments of the Bodhisattva and the long shadow of approaching Buddhahood. We also find the princely power Manju or Manjusri, the Lord of Wisdom. We find all this great company. And we also receive the distinct impression that what we are looking upon now in this entire aggregation is nothing but the extension of the central, seated, poised being in the midst of them. All of these extensions are manifestations of the infinite power of infinite consciousness. They are really embodiments of the central figure itself. They are the infinite reflections, as described in some of the Eastern books, where it is said that the light of one candle, reflected from an infinite number of mirrors, seems to fill space with an infinite number of lights. But there is only one true light, and all the rest is reflection. And in the great drama of the cosmotheism of the Lotus Sutra, all these lights seem to be the strange reflections of the one poised, changeless power that is in the midst of them. The result of the sutra's message, so to say, was to transform the entire concept of Buddhism. The first and most important thing that it did was to change the ancient idea of the Arhat. In Southern Buddhism, the Arhat was a solitary sage who had departed from all worldliness, and taking the begging bowl and turning to the robe, dedicated his life to wandering in lonely isolation in search of truth. This Arhat in the Southern school is supposed to be merely a symbol of Buddha during the period of his own wandering in search of enlightenment. But there is one flaw which even the Southern Buddhists have been forced to admit in their point of view, and that is that the Arhat, by his action, does not follow in the footsteps of the Buddha. Actually, in the great Buddhistic system, the Triratna, or the Three Jewels, are the three great inspirations, or the three great refuges of human consciousness. They are the life of the Buddha, the teaching of the Buddha, and the association of the Sangha, or the monastic body. The Arhat of the Southern school went forth seeking only his own enlightenment. Buddha did not. After the temptation of Buddha, when he achieved enlightenment at Buddha Gaya, and other temptations were past, and he had brought the earth to witness that his law was true, Then was another episode that was very similar to the story of the temptation of Jesus on the Mount. Mara, the illusion, returned to plague the Buddha. Mara said to him, "Master, you have attained enlightenment. You are a perfect Buddha. I bow before you. I admit your authority. However, why now do you not retire into the nirvana and go into infinite rest? Why do you not fulfill the path which you have chosen to walk? Why do you remain in this world now that you are free of it and need it no longer?" This was the temptation. The Buddha resisted it, declaring that it was not his intention to go into the world as a person again, nor to retire from it to solitary eternal rest. His duty was to become the instructor of his fellow men, to go forth teaching them the Noble Eightfold Path. This further confounded Mara, the deity of darkness, for it assailed the foundations of the empire of ignorance. For while the Arhat of the southern school sought only liberation, Buddha himself forfeited his liberation, renounced it, in order to serve his fellow man. And this is a strong point which the northern school has made, that the end of the great path is not that the individual shall seek his own peace, but that he shall fulfill the vow which, according to the Lotus Sutra, he made ages ago when he first put his foot upon the path of enlightenment, namely, that he would not seek eternal peace until he could bring with him every existing sentient being of all worlds. So this supported the Lotus Sutra point of view. For in this sutra we now find all the Arhats, and especially the Bodhisattvas, emerging as the great compassionate ones. Here we come into the presence of Kanman, or Avalokitesvara, the great Bodhisattva of mercy. And we get a clue to something of this by the fact that Kanman, or mercy, is the embodiment of the voice of the Buddha. That it is this embodiment which brings peace in the form of words, in the form of instruction, in the form of inner consolation, and the natural graciousness of life, wherever the kind word is spoken, and the experience of the voice of the teacher is known in the world. So all of these bodhisattvas are again only conditions. They are only stages, infinitely multiplied images of great psychological principles abiding in human consciousness and in universal consciousness. Here also we find the Buddha proclaiming a ministry that is to be taken to all parts of the universe. We find for the first time the record of the rise of Amitabha, the Buddha of the Western Paradise. And we have the glimpse of Gautama preparing to build the paradise of the East. We find the great hollow square of meditation Buddhas and a vast development of symbolism that led to the high mysticism and Tantra of Northern Buddhism. Well, of course, we might say, and quite justly say, that all of this is high fantasy. But the difference that it achieved was that it made possible the dissemination of a teaching which would certainly have died without it. The lonely Arhat, wandering in search of his own perfection, deserting all, separating himself from every aspect of human existence, foregoing marriage and parenthood, leaving his business or profession, giving his goods to others, and in a desolate condition, seeking only enlightenment. This was a very abstractly noble idea, but not suitable or possible as a social state of mankind in general. It had to be limited to the Sangha, to the association of the monks, and it left the whole laity, the great world of people, without any direct participation in the mystery. We had again the same thing in Christianity. In the early days of Christianity, the laity could only serve the priesthood. They could never actually be dynamic participants in the great Eucharistic mysteries of their own faith. They were on the outside, perhaps considered, perhaps to a measure respected, but never permitted to partake of those rites which were for the sanctified, the ordained, and the venerable. This situation in Buddhism would certainly have produced the same kind of stalemate that might have arisen in Christianity without St. Paul. It was necessary to break through this and to create a new democracy in the universe. And the Lotus Sutra is probably one of the most extraordinary statements of democracy. For in it, there is a vast equality under everything else. There is infinite opportunity for all and special privilege for none. Buddhism always had this basic concept, but it unfolded into a magnificent pageantry in the Sutra of the Lotus of the Law. Another point that we have to bear in mind is that Buddhism, unlike most other religions, was a religion of wanderers. Buddhism gradually ceased to have great authority in its own land. Between the revivals of Hinduism and of the Vedantic and Yogic sects, which came very close to Buddhism, absorbed part of it, and in turn contributed something to the Buddhist point of view, and the final ascent of Moslemism in India, the ancient faith vanished from the land. It thereby sentenced itself to a vast pilgrimage over a tremendous area, nearly all of Asia, extending down into the East Indies and over as far as Korea and Japan, upward toward the highest steppes of Siberia, and in the opposite direction all the way to Greece, Egypt, and Eastern Europe. Therefore, it had a tremendous pilgrimage among peoples of many beliefs and many faiths, among peoples who had culture and who did not have culture, to primitive tribes and proud nations. It touched with its magic the extremely primitive people of Tibet and transformed them into a highly cultured group on their own level of thinking. It also then touched a magnificent civilization such as China, which is not in any way primitive, which had its own teachers, its own leaders, which cherished Confucius and Lao Tzu, and it was able to contribute something to the great rise of Chinese, Korean, and Japanese art. All these elements meant that the faith itself had to explode almost like an apocalyptic vision and cover all of Asia, and it did so. And it was able to reach into every level of Asiatic life, as you can see even now. It touched the farmer, the common man, the humble person, the housewife, the tired mother, and the small child. It was no longer in any way a strange aloofness wandering across the face of Asia. And this transformation was almost entirely due to the revelation of the Lotus Sutra. So what happened to it? There was no record of this sutra for a long time. It apparently was not actually known until the 1st or 2nd century A.D., which would probably be 500 years after the parinirvana of Buddha himself. And it is only fair to point out that he declared that the great period of unveiling and revelation and interpretation would begin 500 years after his death. He sensed this, perhaps knew why. But the great sutra of the good law vanished away. No one knew what happened to it. At that time, no one knew the content. They did not have the opportunity to study it in the sacred books of the East. It was then a myth and a mystery. There were rumors that it existed, but no one knew where, no one really had any good answers at all. There was a report that was preserved at Nalanda, the great university in southern India, the great center of the Buddhist tantric philosophy, that this sutra had not been entrusted to any human being at all, for fear that even the most devoted and dedicated disciple, Ananda, the keeper of the records, might be tempted, even by greatness of his own heart, to reveal this sutra before its time. It was one of these things that was timed in some way. It had to come only when the moment was right. Now, skeptics from of other beliefs take a little different and not quite so friendly attitude on this. They insist that it was not preserved, that it was not kept, that it never existed, and that it was actually written at the time it was discovered. Now, this is what might be termed a very modern approach. It would be worthy of one of our higher intellectuals. But the fact remains that in the old legends, and the legends get pretty thick right now, that it was not entrusted to a human being at all, but it was entrusted to the king of the Nagas, the Nagas being the serpents. The serpents in India and in Nalanda were regarded as very strange and mysterious beings. They were always associated in both East and West with a twofold meaning. In both Asia and in the Near East, during Bible times, the serpent was both the symbol of wisdom and the symbol of temptation or cunning. In Egypt we find the same meaning. And we find the well-known admonition in the Bible, "Be ye wise as serpents, and as harmless as doves." So the serpent had a good meaning and a bad meaning. But in almost all ancient peoples, the serpent was an esoteric emblem. It represented one of several things. First, it represented the hidden school, the secret assembly of the Mahatmas, adepts, or bodhisattvas, or arhats, according to your belief, who maintained for centuries the secrets of their order, awaiting the strange symbol or sign which was to indicate the day of revelation. The second symbolism of the serpent in Tantra and in northern India and Tibet and Nepal associates it with yoga, indicating the serpent power, the mysterious spinal fire within man, which when raised up bestows upon man the power of consciousness of inner comprehension. Therefore, that the serpent in this case was the guardian of the inner world, the guardian of that part of consciousness which can only be known when, perhaps to borrow another simile from the Old Testament, the brazen serpent was raised in the wilderness, and all who looked upon it lived. This mysterious type of symbolism perhaps has a bearing upon our present problem. At the great University of Nalanda, there was a tank or pool of blue lotuses, which was built upon the site of the ancient habitation of the Nagas, the serpent kings. In Siam or Thailand, Buddhist figures are nearly always shown seated upon the coils of the great seven-headed Naga, the king of the Nagas, Mukalinda, who, according to the ancient legends, used his hooded cobra head to protect Buddha from all evil, forming of it a kind of canopy or guard against the entry of the evil thoughts of wicked souls. In any event, the serpent symbol was tied into the mystery of the lotus of the good law. It was said that these serpents received this as the most priceless of their heritage, that they dedicated and swore that they would maintain the secret until the coming of the messenger, the one who was appointed to reveal it. And in order that it might never be falsely revealed, they carried it into one of the most distant places of the world, Various stories are advanced as to where this distant place is. Some said that it was in the Himalayas of northern India, some in the plains of southern India. This is the more common version. Others still that it was not in this world at all, but that the secret repository of the great wisdom was suspended in space, like the pagodas and temples that appeared in the great vision of the Blue Lotus Sutra. And around this place, this mysterious and secret abode, the Nagas spun clouds of oblivion so that no one could find it. And they guarded it day and night, and over it they held protection under the great hoods of their cobra heads. And the Nagas regarded this mysterious possession as being the symbol of the possibility of their own ultimate enlightenment, that the time would come when they too would know the mystery of the great enlightenment. So as faithful custodians they gained merit. And there are accounts that many of the bodhisattvas or arhats at different times took upon themselves the forms of Nagas in their embodiment in order that they might become the guardians of the secret treasure. This was the treasure. No one knew exactly what the treasure was at that time. The treasure was supposed to be the living Buddha himself. And if we go a little further into it, we see why this was. Because it was held in ancient times that a sacred sutra, or a book, a manuscript scroll, that contained the words of the teacher, such a document was the teacher. He took upon himself this embodiment. And the Tibetans have a deity, the Prajna Paramita deity, the God that lives in the books of truth. So this is a very interesting sidelight, namely that the book containing the instruction was identical with the teacher himself. About the 3rd century A.D., there arose a very strange man in India. Again, many historians doubt his existence. They think he was another one of those delightful figments. But then again, this was not necessarily unique. It isn't 100 years since most people did not believe Lao Tzu ever lived. And there are still authorities that insist that he is merely a composite of older beliefs. But the Chinese will never accept this point of view. And many of their records go back far enough to very much embarrass critics who are saved largely by their inability to read Chinese. In any event, this man who arose was an arhat, converted to Buddhism from Hinduism. He had been a Brahmin. This is another interesting parallel with St. Paul. Whereas many of the disciples were men of common stature, Paul was a citizen of Rome, the highest honor that a man could have at that time. As a citizen of Rome, he was in this virtue alone, one set apart from the common herd. He was socially an aristocrat, a learned man, a scholar, a deep and penetrating thinker. And most of all, if he had lived in India, it would have been said that he was born of a high caste because of his Roman citizenship. Well, Nagarjuna, as he was called, the serpent taught, part of the tradition of the Nagas. He was a man who, in the legend that we have of him, was a magician. And like some of the great sorcerers of Tibet, he's credited with vast superhuman powers. His abilities were so numerous and diversified that he raised the dead, that he healed the sick, that he was able to travel in the air, that he could move invisibly from place to place. The legends about him are almost limitless, and each one piles further wonders upon those which have previously been heaped together. Now, apparently, Nagarjuna was the one who was waited for. He was the messenger who had been appointed. He did not know this himself, and that was quite according to Buddhism, inasmuch as Gautama did not know his own ministry until the illumination. Up to that time, he was simply a truth seeker like all other sincere human beings. Prior to his embodiment, he knew but through his infancy and childhood he did not know. In the same way, Nagarjuna did not know, except that he felt this strange urge which caused him to depart from his own faith and take on another belief. Some may say that this might have led to complications for the good man, but it did not, because Hinduism at that time was strangely tolerant. Sages and holy men moved about, transferring their allegiances with considerable freedom, and there was very little religious persecution of any kind. So in all probability, his former teachers sent him on to other teachers with a blessing. In any event, there came to him the inner realization, through magic, through incantations, through whatever rites you want to consider. The books are dim, the stories are plentiful. He became aware of the existence of the Sadhana Pundarika Sutta. He knew that it existed. He knew that it was the great esoteric book of Buddhism. He knew that it was the great discourse in which the secret of the large vehicle was to be revealed to the world. So he started out pilgrim-wise to find the book. And he knew what he was looking for. He was looking for the secret place that was guarded by the king of the Nagas and all the faithful people of the serpent. And these same people of the serpent, by the way, occur on our western hemisphere. The Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent. The Aztecs and the Mayas were called the Great Serpent, and their subterranean temples and galleries were the serpent's holes in the earth. And here under the earth the secret mysteries were revealed. So we have the same tradition moving everywhere. And Nagarjuna knew that the serpent had placed the great treasure in the Iron Tower. Now, the Iron Tower has been a subject of art and controversy also for a long time. What was it? We learn in the old scriptures that the planet itself was believed in the old times to be girdled with a wall of iron. Also that a great iron band or wall guarded the sanctuary of Meru, the mountain of the world. The Iron Tower, therefore, seems to represent a term of infinite protection. And from the oldest diagrams and figures in which the Tibetans particularly attempted to picture it, the tower resembles a small reliquary or oriental pagoda. It consists of a square base supporting a short cylinder which tops itself in the form of a half sphere. On this is a sort of roof, square also, with the little pitched ends of a pagoda. And out of this, in the center, rises a spire, surrounded by 9 rings, and surmounted by the blazing pearl. This little pagoda form is still found all of where Buddhism is known. It is still a reliquary. It is most usually found on the properties of monasteries as the abode of the spirits of the great priests who have gone before. It may be built over a relic, some small remain of a physical priest. But actually the great golden pagoda at Rangoon, the Shwe Dagon, the golden dragon, is such a pagoda in the Burmese form. The great Vats of Siam are also such pagodas. And in China, we have them rising like little buildings of several stories, like towers. Whereas in Japan, we are more apt to find the old Hindu or Tibetan style predominating. Somewhere was the Iron Tower. And in the Iron Tower, the mystery of the law slept, waiting revelation. And by his magic, Nagarjuna was able to find the Iron Tower. Some say that when he reached there, an ancient sage was dwelling near the tower. Some say that this sage was a vision sent from another world. as the visions of age, sickness, and death were sent to the young Prince Gautama before he became a Buddha. Some say that Nagarjuna was instructed by this sage, and that this was the real secret of the whole thing. Others say no, this doesn't quite explain everything. But anyway, however it may be, the wise men, the Nagas, whether they be adepts or sages, whether the Iron Tower was a symbol of the eternal Shambhala, the abode of the gods, whatever the mystery may be, from the Iron Tower, Nagarjuna received the Lotus Sutra. Now, those who wish to say that he wrote it and the rest of it is a legend, who can deny them? Who can affirm anything? The only thing that we can say is that if he did write it himself, the rest is fable. He produced one of the most extraordinary works in the history of the world. So he produced something by means of which the teachings of a lonely Indian mendicant, honored, loved, venerated, but seldom understood, these teachings were made available to the great mass of the Asiatic people. And from this sutra and its implications arose what we know as the wheel of the great doctrine, the Northern School, the school that transformed Buddhism from a patient waiting for the unknown to a dynamic building towards an enlightened human society. Some will say, and the Southern Buddhists insist, that all this was a sustaining of the teachings of Buddha. But if you study the Mahayana scriptures carefully, and there are others that came later besides the one of the Great Law, the other sutras, of course, are commentaries and interpretations by the great patriarchs of the various schools. But this one unique sutra has been held in common by all northern Asiatic peoples. It is the foundation of Lamaism in Tibet. It is the foundation of Chinese Buddhism. It was the great power that created Japanese Buddhism. It was present to a modified degree, but rather strongly, in Korea. Wherever the great motion of Buddhism passed, it contributed to the glory of it. It gave the world the wonders of the Buddha Babur in Java, and the great cosmological monuments that are still to be found in the most remote parts of China. No longer, unfortunately, can we visit them. In any way we wish to look at it, a new dispensation occurred. And this is traced distinctly to the opening of the doors of the Iron Tower. From that time on, the new revelation was prepared for the service of mankind. And Nagarjuna, if he invented it, if he wrote it, merely elevated himself to one of the highest places known in the levels of spiritual consciousness. It is unlikely that he wrote it. It is most unlikely, because he was but a recent convert from Hinduism. Had he written it, he would have most certainly involved in it much more Brahmanical philosophy. Like all Buddhism, he borrows some, but not excessively. The only other possible explanation is the one of the sage whom we met at the Iron Tower, who may have had an older contact. Some have tried to insist that the doctrine was in existence among certain sages for a century or more before Nagarjuna. It is all myth. It is all legend. But out of this strange, legendary foundation arose something that was not legend in any sense of the word. As a result of the gradual interpretation of this sutra, which was copied with the commentaries of Nagarjuna, also Nagarjuna prepared his own commentaries, by which he was elevated to the estate of the 14th patriarch of the Great Descent. and even sects that do not follow precisely his instruction still acknowledge that he is of the highest order of canonization, that he is one who is already a bodhisattva, to go on to still higher achievements in the northern school. We now have the primary differentiation between the two schools. We have, first of all, the doors of Buddhism strangely open to all men. Buddha opened the first gate by disregarding the caste system. He declared that regardless of birth, regardless of race, regardless of affiliation, the individual could attain enlightenment. That there was no person so ignorant that inevitable enlightenment was not his, by a right beyond any power of man to destroy. But Buddha did not clearly indicate the difference between the clergy and the laity. He created, and probably very wisely in his own time, because after all he was establishing a school, which was later to unfold, but he had to give it body. And he did this by the Sangha. He established the orders of the monks. And during his lifetime he lived to see this community increase in number, regain honor and distinction, and he also established the monastic orders for women. But the northern school, the revelation of the Blue Lotus, suddenly opened the way of salvation to persons not dedicated to the clergy. The way of salvation eliminated the absolute requirement of monastic orders. The northern school held firmly that illumination, enlightenment, spiritual progress, growth, and unfoldment were based entirely upon virtue, upon integrity, upon the individual performing to the very best of his ability those duties and responsibilities which were his natural requirements. Therefore, it was perfectly possible for the household, or the parent, the child, the individual who continued to be a shopkeeper, who practiced the professions, who did whatever was naturally his occupation, his redemption, his illumination, his regeneration resulted from his faithful maintenance of the integrity of his own activity, whatever it might be. He was not to become an arhat by no longer being a physician, but by becoming a greater physician. He was not to wander off into aloneness if he was an attorney, but he was to stay and judge righteous judgment. Whatever he was doing, this was the area of his karma. Here it was that he must fulfill his message, his ministry, and his purpose. And all good deeds accomplished by him contributed to his enlightenment, just as certainly as privation or detachment from worldliness. The Mahayana took the idea that this detachment was not a walking out on worldliness, but a detachment from selfishness, from self-seeking, from all these negative or destructive attitudes, by means of which we exploit or betray the tasks and duties which we should properly and nobly perform. So this was the next step in the great motion of Buddhistic democracy. It had already extended to the animal kingdom and accepted the animal as the brother. It had extended itself to the mysterious beings of the invisible worlds, ghosts, demons, monsters, and formed them all into acolytes of the Buddhistic order. Now it was to transform the problem of Buddhism itself. From the secret books of the Iron Tower, it was also pointed out that there was the heart path to realization. That the heart represented, actually in Buddhism, by the assembly of the Bodhisattvas, was as sure a path, as certain a road to illumination, as any reasoning, any meditation, any abstract discipline, any self-style. But actually, the wise man and the good man, these two are one. Both have achieved exactly the same end. For wisdom must end in goodness. And that which is good is truly wise, regardless of all other attainments. So the good person, the individual in whose heart and mind there was the continuing remembrance of the law, this constituted the heart path to enlightenment. So it was certainly this approach that captured the heart of Asia. It was this approach which resulted in the triumphant march of Buddhism across a third of the surface of the earth. It also contributed everything to the great artistic cultural heritage in which Buddhism became so closely identified. Here was the inspiration of a great art. Here was the reverence and the gentleness. There was the subtle hopes, the mystery of a world of beauty and truth. It was concealed from the common state of man, only by a very thin veil. It seemed under such conditions that almost anyone at any moment might see these luminous figures rise before him. If he looked at the sunset, he could see the radiant head of the Amida circled by the halo of the setting sun. Everywhere, the universe became filled with light beings. And by degrees, these light beings overcame all the shadows which had held men in fear and doubt and bondage for ages. The Northern Buddhist school suddenly gave to man an invisible universe of beauty with which to surround himself. It gave him a universe of infinite hope. It gave him the solemn assurance of the sages that all would come well. And in this system, because of its complete lack of, almost we would say, complete lack of any trace of intolerance, there was no longer any war of creed. Men did not fail because they belonged to another faith. Hunan, the great Buddhist mystic, describes how the saints of other religions have all achieved bodhisattvahood, but all the good and the pure and the noble everywhere are part of this glorious company of the radiant ones. So the universe suddenly became almost as in the apocalyptical vision of the Blue Lotus, an extent of beings as far as mind and consciousness could conceive, all chanting together the glory of the doctrine, all bearing witness together to the infinite wisdom, infinite graciousness of truth, a cosmic revelation of beauty, a universe of principles, all of them benevolent, in which there was no evil principle, no power of ultimate evil anywhere, evil being only man's ignorance, being the darkness which he has cast upon himself. So this vision, of course, was in some way tremendously acceptable. We can understand why this would be. We can also understand why in local periods when times were fortunate, as in the age of the Fujiwara in Japan, great princes and kings, the rulers of the highest families, both men and women of the imperial house, resigned their temporal honors and took holy orders. Emperors became monks. Empresses became nuns. And the great and powerful nobles united together in their efforts to create on earth a visible commonwealth based upon the mysteries of Amida's Western paradise. The idea was to beautify everything, to make the whole world a sanctuary of beauty and of good, to transform this earth into a wonder similar to paradise. In this, of course, they had a certain basic indoctrination from the northern school, in which it was assumed that it was the task of the Buddha Gautama to transform this planet into his eastern paradise and rule over our world as Amida ruled over the paradise of the West. So everyone was helping or trying to help or thinking about helping to make this great beauty a reality. Obviously, these tremendous spurts of idealism could not be maintained. The intensities of life would not permit it. One by one, these ancient shrines were deserted, or at least became merely great treasures of nations to be shown to travelers, even to be used still for religious purposes. But there was this tremendous outburst of divine hope. And this was represented in the final culmination of most of these Buddhist schools in Japan, where alone we can study them today. There is practically no other place where we can study them. And that is the rising of the 10 or 12 schools, according to different classifications of Buddhists in Japan. The first two schools, those which came under the direct supervision of Prince Shotoku, belonged to the Southern School. They were the severe school of the renunciation of the world and the arhat wandering into the lowlands. But they vanished away, and little remains but their monuments. And almost immediately, the northern schools took over Japanese consciousness. It was firmly established for the 7th or 8th century. Then came the burst of art. Then came the wonderful unfoldment of architecture, of music, of the theater, of literature, of all the craft and artistic procedures. But gradually the tea ceremony, the flower arrangement, the no drama, all these things came out of this tremendous impact of artistry. And this whole artistry is almost completely an effort to capture in some way this apocalyptic vision of the Lotus Sutra. In some way, this sutra has become the inspiration for all that followed after. In the Chinese versions, in the early printed forms of the Sung and early Ming dynasties, the sutras are illustrated with great panoramas indicating the assemblages. Similar paintings exist at Chonhuan and Tufan in Xinjiang and in Chinese Turkestan. These great symbols are also captured in the idea of the Buddha of Kamakura in Japan, the seated Buddha which we all know so well, over 40 feet in height. This quiet meditating figure is an effort to capture in the majestic proportions of itself something of the vision of the Lotus Sutra. The great Buddha Vivekananda at Nara, that is much larger, also represents the idea of the great teacher in his body of universal light. The only way they could even indicate it was by increasing the size or dimension, the image. This process goes on throughout all the symbolism. In all these symbols we find the historical teacher, Gautama, not lost, not gone forever, but submerged in the vast manifestations of himself. Behind all of it is recognized the strange likeness of himself. For it was his own extraordinary revelation which created in man the archetype of all that was to follow. But upon this archetype was built the tremendous structure of interpretation, which finally was represented in the rise of the northern sect. Today we have in Japan and in China, where we can get at them, Hong Kong and Formosa, in Korea, where they can be reached at all, and in other isolated areas, formerly in Tibet, still in Nepal. We do have the continuous functioning of the northern system. We have Gautama not so prominently displayed, but assumed and implied. For every figure of the Buddha that exists is merely an expression of the Gautama form. They're all based upon the one form. Every one of these transcendent beings in all their glories are nothing but a representation of Buddha at the moment of his illumination. All the wonderful bodhisattvic robes and jewels and adornments
are all based upon Prince Siddhartha before the Enlightenment, when he was Prince of Kapilavastu, and therefore in his full royal habiliments. All the quiet, shaven-headed monks and all the arhats are merely Buddha the Wanderer. They're wandering around in Bengal, looking for teachers that could give him the instruction. All images are nothing but an extension of him. But in the course of this extension, this tremendous symbolic process, these extensions have taken on certain individualities of their own and are so regarded and venerated. But it is incorrect to say that they are worshipped. In the Northern School, we have several sects, such as the Jodo and the Shin and the Jodo Shin and the Honganji, and many other sects, including the Nichiren-shu. These are Japanese schools. Every one of them adore the Sutra, the Lotus of the Law. All of them are revelations based upon the strange, rather intense and gruff personality of Shonen Nichiren. This man was always belligerent, always a stormy force in the life of the country while he was alive, who lived in its stormiest period at the time of the threatened invasion by the hosts of Kublai Khan. This man, in his meditation, was seeking to give the people of Japan an interpretation of the greatest, the most important, and most profound concept to be found anywhere in Buddhism. He wanted to give them the soul of the doctrine. And obviously and inevitably, he revealed it to them through the Sutra of the Lotus of the Good Law, which is the most sacred book of that sect. It is the sacred book of all the Amida sects of Japan and some others also. It is very strong in the undercurrent of Zen, though not so obvious. In every instance, it is the revelation of a great universal life principle. The universe unfolds as in the apocalyptic vision of the Sutra itself, to be an infinite world of infinite growth, with all things moving inevitably toward peace, toward a great happiness, not an extinction, but a reunion with life, not a ceasing, but a oneness with the magnificent thrill of eternal existence. Not the darkness of oblivion, not the dying out of everything, but the gradual dying out of error, until relieved of this, and with the inner light of his own consciousness, man looking at the sunrise, looking out over the mountains, looking into the cities and towns, looking into the eyes of his own children, sees everywhere the magnificent pageantry of the Lotus Sutra. Everything filled with life. Everything filled with infinite beatitude. Everything thrilling and moving by laws that are immutable. And these laws are forever mercifully administered by those who understand them. For the laws are revealed through those who know them. The great body of the law through the enlightened power of the Buddha Shakyamuni, the great orthodox. All the transcendent interpretation, all the subtle mysteries of hope and faith and kindness, all the healing powers, the consoling forces, all administered by the great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Here the whole universe consists of dedicated souls serving the law and bringing all life to conscious insight, oneness with the purpose of the law. There is no strange emotionalism such as we have in some other religions. It is not an emotional faith, but it is a faith of great quietude. And out of this great quietude, this solemn assurance of all things, comes a kind of emotion that is a little difficult to understand, but is definitely there. It is the emotion of a strange, transcendent certainty. An emotion in which the bereaved does not weep for the lost one, but has some strange, quiet, and perhaps a little sad realization in himself that all of this is part of the infinite process of infinite good. That everything is within the light that shines from the urna, the great coiled pearl of light on the forehead of the infinite Buddha. That as this light shines into all places in space, it reveals worlds that we do not know. It brings light into the most obscure corners of creation and eternity. But wherever the light strikes, if it goes off into some distant star, if it goes into the uttermost parts of space, wherever this light strikes, there will be found the assemblies of the Arhats. There will be found the gracious faces of the Bodhisattvas. There enthroned among them will be the Buddhas of the 10 directions of space. Everywhere, the law. Perhaps what Buddha wanted to try to carry through in this was the transcendency of the law itself. Not a law that we can comprehend fully, but a law beyond any question of doubt. The time of the temptation scene, the strange moment when Buddha awaited illumination under the bo tree. So the hosts of Mara came to tempt him, and universal confusion closed in upon him in an effort to turn him from the quiet internal realization which he saw. The hosts of the material world, symbolized by Mara, said, we own all things. We are masters of it. We are the kings and the emperors. We have all strength, all authority. And we have a whole creation of ignorant, but nevertheless highly opinionated beings that are ready to testify to us. They will bear witness to our power. They will bear witness to their daily thoughts that they fear Caesar. They will bear witness in every moment of their lives that most of all they want to perpetuate this physical existence even though it corrupts their souls. We have witnessed that materiality is supreme. Then Mara turned to the Buddha, who was just attaining enlightenment, and he said, who do you have to bear witness? Buddha made the mudra, which is found on many of his images, called the earth witnessing. He puts his hand down and touches the earth. And when he does so, the great Earth Mother, like the wonderful elder of the Nibelungen, the great Earth Mother rises before him. And she says, I bear witness. I am the great mother of all that lives. I bear witness. I am the one whose infinite laws, infinite processes of birth, growth, maturity, of decay, processes of little birds coming from the eggs, processes of the ripe grain growing in the field, the processes of the trees heavy with fruit, processes birds knowing where to go in migration. Everywhere, these processes are the law. And these processes we call nature. The Earth Mother said, I am nature. I bear witness that every law of nature bears witness to the truth of this fact. This was not only the beginning of the earth witnessing, but probably was one of the roots of the Lotus Sutra. It is one of many intimations that are found in the earliest records. For Buddha, with his hand in the earth witnessing posture, is known much earlier than the attributed date of the founding or discovery of this sutra. So the earth witnessing episode, while probably legendary also, goes back very far. But its main purpose is expressed by the teacher in his own words, that he asks no one to believe anything unless they can prove it in daily life.
Actually, to be practical.
The daily life,
means that we
the
can
happiness
do
and the
the
sorrow,
good for
the
the
coming
greater
and the going,
and we
the rising and the
by
falling,
making the change
all of the
in
things
our
that happen every day,
more better
these bear witness to the law.
will reduce wars.
The law is not based upon revelation. No God pronounced it. No vast conspiracy of heaven decreed it.
And all these things
It is
which are
eternal.
part of a great
But everything that exists witnesses it.
which is we have
And the
permitted
perfect witness of the law,
we have had
that in which it is entirely embodied,
depth of understanding.
the mysterious golden figure
Grow sometimes.
seated in the midst of the universe
So we have to suffer a little as we go.
in the
But
lotus
this
sutra,
suffering, if it produces in
seated upon the lotus of nature,
is well worth what it
rising by the very processes of eternal growth,
21st century. With education,
seated forever in the absolute composure of complete
spreads from
acceptance.
there throughout the
This
world.
figure
The
symbolizes,
individual who starts out
in a
right,
strange
in the
way,
beginning
an
of his
extraordinary achievement
ideals
possible to
and
man.
motives that are true.
It can be accepted, it can be
I know
rejected.
several families in which
It can be held to be an answer, or it may be denied.
never will be.
Some will not consider that it is
They're very
religious at
happy
all,
in that family.
but it is a
They're
strange
much
proclamation
more
of
happy
religion.
than these,
But
families
certainly,
who are
in moving across the face of Asia,
they have what they have
it
because
became
as a family.
the most civilizing power that the East has ever
They
known.
love each other. They work
And in many
together.
respects, it accomplished for them a civilizing influence that the West has never known.
In the integrities of the
Because the West has always
they always attempt to live it.
looked upon space
It is
as a
not
great
the
void
sake
to be
of it.
conquered by
You
man.
can seldom if ever find
It is a great emptiness to be filled by human ingenuity.
that is happy.
Man was a creature, space was nothing.
Foliage, there is nothing but conflict.
Man was a being, space was beingless. Man has a mind, space is mindless. This has been the common thought of the
therefore,
West.
we should all be educating
While we held religion, we never permitted it, in most instances, to dominate our conduct to the degree that it modified our ambitions.
Then we have to work
So in the
those
West,
who are older.
when the thinker looks out into
Well,
space,
age group.
he sees only a mystery extending on and on and on through physical extension
Age.
to infinity.
But there is nothing there to
But
worry
the
about.
Buddhist, looking into the same direction of space, if he uses the outer eyes of his body, sees exactly what the scientist sees. Nothing.
Yeah. Woman, said
But in the quietude of himself,
he was lying in
something
the
happens.
back of the little
He begins to feel
house
something.
in
He discovers within himself that this space is not empty, that he is not alone, that his own kind is not unique or the only thing that was ever produced by nature.
He was lying on his couch.
And in his meditation and his mysticism,
Sitting up a little bit.
the extension of his own
And he
mental
was listening
processes,
attentively
his
to the
intuitive
voice of the front
processes,
row.
his inward imagery, suddenly causes this space to blaze out
Grandfather,
as a magnificent universe of
I'm
value.
going to die in a few hours.
He sees life everywhere, law everywhere, beauty everywhere, truth
But
everywhere.
I'm alive now.
And to
I'm
him,
alive. I can
those who
live.
have gone before in this infinite path of growth
While we were alive, we
turn
can
back
and learn.
as kindly
While we were
elders,
alive, we can earn a better destiny.
as dedicated
We
friends,
can make a great move of
to
some
help
kind in
him.
the closing years of life.
And this whole hierarchy is that of dedication. No man might see these strange half-opened eyes looking at him and through him. And perhaps in a moment of inner vision, he might turn to see if they are looking at something behind him, because they do not seem to be focused directly on
We
him.
must believe that
This
if
is true of practically all these
part
images.
of their future is here.
And if he gets this feeling, he is correct.
Most of their future is
The
elsewhere.
image is not looking at
But
him.
in any case, there is
The
future.
image is looking at infinity.
Certain is death for the living.
Behind the man who faces the image
Regular people.
is an infinite process of
Eternal
existence.
quest for reality,
This face is looking past
for
him,
that kind of inner
into the roots of himself,
which is
into the animal
peace,
world,
which is passive understanding.
into all the creatures
Here to
of the
grow,
elements,
to learn, to love,
mysterious creatures we know nothing about,
and if we fulfill these
plants
desires,
and minerals and atoms and
very
electrons.
much. And a world that
This
becomes
saving
aware
face
and begins to try
is
to
not
do it,
devoted
will
completely
gain
to
very
him.
rapidly.
He is only an incident
between now and
in
the
the
end
great
of this
process
century,
of
we will
salvation.
find major changes in
The
the body
face of this
education.
meditating
We will
power
find new approaches
must
to
redeem
the
all that
teaching.
exists.
We shall try to
It must
understand
find,
the
understand, share,
graduating
enlighten
theology from the university
even the
with
tiniest
all narcotics
electron.
at the same time.
Everything
These
must
things
move
presenting
into
to
this
us,
great pageant,
as in the case of
must unfold
marijuana,
its divinity and its beauty
alcohol.
till it becomes
These are all
likewise the
presenting to
shining
us
servant
the
of
fact
eternal
that as
truth.
individuals, we
This
have
was
not
the vision of the
been
Lotus
taught to be
Sutra.
strong.
This is what
We have not been
Nagarjuna
taught
said,
to cling to what
contained
is
in the
right.
iron
We
tower
have not
guarded
been
for the
taught
purpose.
to put the good of ourselves
May mean that it was the
at the
eternal
head
doctrine,
of our list. We know the
held in secret
habits
by ancient orders
or
of priests,
destroy us so completely.
perhaps
that
if
we
Buddhism is correct,
But
brought
never
from other
occurs
worlds
to
and other
feel
suns and other
this
aeons
promise of the moment
into
which
this
we feel
world of
things
ours.
foretold
Like
is
the
most
mysterious,
important.
fabulous pagoda floating in space,
That's not very
in
close.
the inner
This
vision of
feeling
the Lotus
of being
Sutra.
10 feet high
In any
is
event,
not meant to us.
this to the Buddhist
Actually, at this
is the
moment,
supreme
whatever
achievement of his faith,
feels 10 feet
his
high.
sudden discovery
Everything
of the
is
living universe,
their little problem.
universe alive in spirit, in soul, and in mind,
Everyone will be real.
universe of
Everyone
infinite
will
wisdom,
live his own
infinite
life.
love,
No one will be
manifesting
responsible.
forever
The
through
cities will
infinite
take care
love.
of the children.
This was the
Some other city
apocalyptic
will take care
vision,
of the aged.
and
each
the
individual
tracing
will
of it,
belong
and
to
the
that
story
common
of it, and
generation.
the legends around it
Now, this is
are
not
among the
like
most
it's
fascinating and interesting of
This
all
is the
Eastern
same
stories.
thing as taking cocaine.
Well, I think our time is up, so thank you
Has
very
already
much.
ruled the world. Our world has been fed on various false drugs.
Well, we know that the Asiatic mind is very highly dramatic. Many of the great legends of the world have come from the East, and even those which we normally associate with the West may have had Oriental origins. Legends are wonderful ways of maintaining human interest in events which in themselves may be difficult or remote in time. So this evening we are going to study a fragment of the great transition which occurred in the descent of the Buddhistic tradition in the Far East. The southern school of Buddhism, depending largely upon the Pali texts, has been termed the conservative school. Legends have arisen there, but they are few, and for the most part are held within the severity of what the southern Buddhists believed to be the canonical writings. The southern Buddhists depend almost entirely upon the earliest texts, and these, as might be expected, are the least embellished. Also, in the case of Buddhism, and a good parallel will be found in Christianity, actually Buddha left no written words that we are able to discover. As in most religious situations, the early perpetuation was by oral tradition only. And the Southern school takes it for granted that the earliest traditions, the earliest oral records, must necessarily be the most accurate. There may be considerable space for disagreement on this point, however. We are not sure that this This evening we begin a series of excursions into high legendary. And perhaps we might take a moment to introduce the general theme. As you probably well know, most of the sources of our knowledge of the great religions of the world are historically uncertain. We find that even in religious and philosophical systems that have come into existence in the last 1,000 years, data is seldom adequate. Perhaps one reason lies in the fact that most of the human experiences which have resulted in an important revelation have been highly subjective to the historical person. Usually, such information was scanty. During the person's life, he was not honored, he was not recognized, he found very little place in the pages of history. But the human mind is not inclined to leave matters like this. And gradually, myth fills in where history is inadequate. Always also there are certain tales, legends, stories that have descended from one generation to another. These have frequently been considerably amplified in the passing of time. And where a religious factor is present, the miraculous is almost always superimposed upon the meager, demonstrable facts. This is true all over the world, and it is especially true in Asia. The sutras, or records of the teachings of Buddha, are divided into two groups. The early records belonging to the Southern School are acknowledged. They are affirmed to exist, and they are still the foundation of all that was built upon them. The Northern School, however, claimed to possess other records, that in one way or another there had descended to them further instruction, arising also in the original words of Buddha, not merely in commentary, but in actual discourses which the great teacher gave. The Northern School, therefore, divided the teachings of Buddha into a series of periods. They said that Buddha, at different times in his life, revealed different levels or layers of his instruction. It is said of Jesus that he taught the multitude in parables, but to the disciples he taught certain other things. Christendom does not know what those certain other things were. There seems to have been no descent in record. In Buddhism, the certain other things which Buddha may have taught are at least claimed to have been preserved. In the course, therefore, of the ministry of Buddha, beginning with the Prajnaparamita Sutra, his instruction is regarded as having become gradually more deep and more complete. And that as he passed along through his 45 years of earthly ministry, there were occasions when to those peculiarly wise or remarkably venerable he gave other instructions. And upon these other instructions, the Northern School is built. These other instructions have been very bewildering to Western Orientalists. During the 19th century, when nearly all writers on Buddhistic matters were either military men stationed in India, merchants, travelers, or missionaries, there was a great fondness for the Southern School. The peculiar severity of the doctrine, its profound skepticism, and the vestiges which seemed to linger in the Southern belief, affirming that Buddha was atheistic, and also that he did not believe in the immortality of the human soul. These thoughts were quickly and eagerly grasped by the missionaries. It provided them with a splendid armament against Buddhism as far as Western thinking was concerned. They were in a position to contrast the best of Christianity with the worst of Buddhism, and came up with some very dramatic, if not entirely realistic, conclusions. In any event, We are indebted mostly to these doubtful sources, some of them highly obviously prejudiced, for our Western concept of this Eastern philosophy almost to the time of the turn of the present century. Actually, of course, our knowledge of the whole matter in the West was probably only 200 or 300 years old, as far as any effort at scholarship or estimation could be concerned. As a result of this mass of early publication, highly critical, an attitude was established in the Western mind, an attitude that was not especially sympathetic. What these same scholars were very reluctant to bring forth was the Northern is actually true, because these early records sometimes lack perspective. They represent highly localized points of view. We have, therefore, a parallel again with the Christian problem. The early Christian records are divided sharply into two groups. The records assumed to have been left by the apostles, the original group of disciples, and a rather different record which arose from the convictions of St. Paul. Pauline Christianity was quite different in many ways from the original revelation as it has come down to us. So we naturally ask the question, what was the source of the information of St. Paul? Why did he differ from the so-called gospel narratives in so many details? The answer appears to be that Paul had access to material which has not generally survived. He had the possibility of talking with others, of observing the reactions not of the 12, but of the stranger, of those who had only been beholders and not participants in the great Christian drama. From some point of view, either within himself or from circumstances, Paul grasped a structure that was more or less overlooked or ignored or even perhaps denied by those who were the closest of the apostles. The same thing happened in Asia. And perhaps the best way we can unfold this little story is to follow the legends, at least for a part of the way. In the northern school,